Before we begin, I need to tell you about a 19-year-old boy who had a dream that most people thought was crazy. He wanted to be a farmer. Not just any farmer, but a farmer in one of the most remote, desolate places in America. So remote that his nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. So isolated that cell service barely worked. So empty that it was just him, his grain truck, and 2,000 acres of desert land that nobody else wanted. His name was Dylan Rounds. And on May 28, 2022, he called his grandmother to say he had to move his seed truck because it was raining. That was the last time anyone ever heard from him. His boots were found yards from where he should have been. His truck looked like it had been power washed clean. And his closest neighbor, a 60-year-old ex-con living in a trailer, had a gun with Dylan's blood on it. If you're new to Crime Case Voices, this channel tells the stories of victims whose lives were stolen too soon and exposes the failures that let their killers walk free. Like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications because Dylan Round's story will break your heart and make you furious. And if you believe a 19-year-old chasing his dream deserved better than what happened to him, leave a comment below. Now let's begin. Dylan Rounds grew up in Idaho, Twin Falls and Idaho Falls, splitting time between his divorced parents' homes. He had a younger brother and sister who looked up to him. And from the time he was a little boy, Dylan had one obsession: farming. Not playing video games, not sports, not parties or girls or any of the typical teenage stuff. Farming. He loved everything about it. The machinery, the land, the process of planting seeds and watching them grow into something that feeds people. Most kids dream about being astronauts or professional athletes. Dylan dreamed about driving a combine harvester across endless fields. Most teenagers want to move to the city, experience nightlife, be where the action is. Dylan wanted to move to the most remote corner of Utah he could find in farmland that most people considered worthless desert. His family thought he was a little crazy, but they also recognized something special in him. Dylan wasn't just daydreaming. He was planning, saving money, researching, learning everything he could about farming. When other kids his age were spending money on concerts and clothes, Dylan was saving every dollar for his future farm. In 2019, when Dylan was just 16 years old, he and his grandfather made a deal. Together, they purchased farmland in Lucin, Utah. If you've never heard of Lucin, that's because almost nobody has. It's not even really a town anymore. It used to be a railroad community, but it's been mostly abandoned for decades. The population is basically zero. The nearest actual town is Montello, Nevada, 30 miles away. The land is cheap because it's desert, it's remote, and most people don't want to live there. But Dylan wanted it. He saw potential where others saw wasteland. He saw his future farm where others saw sand and sagebrush. He saw his dream coming true where others saw an impossible challenge. And for 3 years, he worked toward making that dream real. By May 2022, Dylan was 19 years old and living on his farm full-time. He dropped out of high school to pursue farming, which worried his parents, but they supported him because they knew this wasn't a phase. This was Dylan's life. He lived in a camper trailer on the property. No running water, no real amenities, just him and the land and his equipment. He'd drive the 30 miles to Montello when he needed food or supplies. Otherwise, he was alone on his farm, working from sunrise to sunset, preparing for his first real crop. His parents visited when they could. His mom, Candace Cooley, would bring him supplies. His dad, Justin Rounds, would help with equipment. But mostly, Dylan was independent. He was doing exactly what he'd always wanted to do. He was living his dream. And at 19 years old, he was succeeding. He had the land. He had the equipment. He was about to plant his first crop. Everything was coming together exactly as he'd planned. May 26, 2022, Thursday, Dylan drove to Montello, Nevada, to grab some food at the Saddle Sore Bar. Nothing unusual, just a teenager getting a meal at the local spot. People saw him there. He seemed normal, happy, focused on getting back to work. He ate, paid his bill, and drove back to Utah, back to his farm, back to the work he loved. May 28, 2022, Saturday, late morning, Dylan called his grandmother. It was raining, a rare occurrence in the Utah desert. He told her he needed to move his seed truck into the shed so the seeds wouldn't get ruined. Rain could destroy his entire investment if those seeds got wet. "I can't talk right now," he told his grandmother. "It's raining. I gotta get my seed truck." His grandmother said, "Okay, talk to you later." The call ended. Dylan went to move his truck. And that was it. That was the last time anyone in Dylan Round's family heard his voice. By Monday, May 30th, when Dylan's mom couldn't reach him, she knew something was wrong. Dylan always stayed in contact. Even living alone in the desert, he called regularly. He checked in. He let people know he was okay. 2 days of silence wasn't like him. Candace drove to the farm. What she found there made her blood run cold. Do you think you could live alone in the desert at 19? Chasing a dream everyone else thought was impossible? Dylan did. And someone made sure he'd never see that dream come true. Comment below with your thoughts. When Candace Cooley arrived at her son's farm on May 30th, 2022, she expected to find Dylan working on his equipment or maybe dealing with a broken-down truck that had kept him out of cell range. She did not expect what she actually found. Evidence that made it immediately clear something terrible had happened. Dylan's grain truck was there, but something was off. The truck looked wrong. It looked too clean. Candace later told investigators it appeared to have been power washed. The seats had been moved from their normal positions. In the desert, with red dust coating everything within minutes, a spotlessly clean truck stands out. It looks suspicious. It looks like someone was cleaning up evidence. And then there were the boots. Dylan's boots were found in the dirt, yards away from his grain truck, in the opposite direction from his camper trailer. This was the detail that convinced Candace that her son hadn't just wandered off or had an accident. Dylan only owned one pair of boots at a time. He wore the same style, same brand, and when they wore out, he'd buy the exact same pair again. His mom knew this because she'd bought him boots before. She knew her son never went anywhere without his boots. A kid doesn't walk in the desert without his boots. The terrain is rough, rocks, cacti, scorching sand, rattlesnakes. You don't take a stroll barefoot or in socks. If Dylan's boots were sitting in the dirt by his truck, it meant he didn't leave willingly. It meant he didn't walk away from his dream farm. It meant something happened to him right there, right by that truck, and he never had a chance to put his boots back on. Candace called the police immediately. She reported her son missing, and she told them from minute one, "This is foul play. This is not a runaway. This is not a kid who got lost in the desert. My son was taken or hurt, and you need to start looking for him right now." The Box Elder County Sheriff's Office responded, along with the FBI, since the area is so remote and crosses state lines. They began processing Dylan's farm as a potential crime scene. Investigators documented everything: the clean truck, the repositioned seats, the boots in the dirt. They searched the area around the farm, looking for any sign of Dylan, alive or dead. They brought in search dogs. They checked the camper trailer where Dylan had been living. They looked for his phone, his wallet, anything that might tell them what happened. His key fob was missing. His phone wasn't in the camper or in his truck. It was like Dylan had simply vanished into the desert air, leaving behind only his boots and a truck that looked like someone had tried to erase evidence from it. Cell phone data showed that Dylan's phone had last communicated with cell towers on May 28th, near his farm. After that, nothing. The phone either died, was turned off, or was destroyed. Given the circumstances, investigators feared the worst. But without a body, without witnesses, without clear evidence of what had happened, they were stuck. This was a missing person case. A suspicious missing person case, but still just a missing person case. The family wasn't waiting for official search parties. Candace, Justin, and their extended family and friends descended on Lucen. They organized their own searches, walking the desert, calling Dylan's name, hoping against hope they'd find him injured but alive, waiting for rescue. The desert is vast and unforgiving. Dylan could have been hurt and unable to make it back to his camper. He could be lying somewhere just out of sight, needing help. The family clung to that hope even as days turned into a week. But the searches turned up nothing. No sign of Dylan. No tracks leading away from the farm. No evidence of where he might have gone or been taken. Just empty desert stretching for miles in every direction. And lurking in the back of everyone's minds was the question no one wanted to ask out loud. Who did this? Who would want to hurt a 19-year-old kid living alone on a farm in the middle of nowhere? The answer was closer than anyone wanted to admit, because Dylan wasn't completely alone out there. He had a neighbor, just one, about 5 miles away, a 60-year-old man living in a trailer on property where he was basically squatting. A man with a criminal history. A man who'd been convicted of being a felon in possession of a firearm and had served prison time for it. A man who'd worked for Dylan, helping him bale hay. A man Dylan knew and probably trusted to some degree. His name was James Brenner. And very soon, investigators were going to take a very close look at him. Because Dylan's phone, when they finally located it, was found near a pond by Brenner's trailer. And when they searched Brenner's trailer, they found something that would change this case from a missing person investigation to a homicide. Evidence that Dylan Round's blood had been in that trailer. Evidence that suggested Dylan hadn't just disappeared. He'd been murdered. The family's worst fears were about to be confirmed. Their search for a missing son was about to become a search for justice in his murder. And the man responsible was someone Dylan had known, someone who'd been on his property, someone Dylan probably never saw coming until it was too late. If you were Dylan's parent and you found his boots sitting in the dirt, what would you think? Would you immediately suspect foul play? Or would you try to convince yourself there was another explanation? Drop your thoughts below. James Brenner, 60 years old, living in a trailer on property in Lucin where he had no legal right to be. The kind of man who drifts from place to place, never quite settling, never quite following the rules. And the kind of man with a past that should have sent up red flags to anyone who knew about it. Brenner had a criminal history. In 2012, he'd been convicted of being a felon in possession of a firearm. That conviction earned him 33 months in federal prison. For those who don't know, being a felon in possession of a firearm is a serious charge. It means you've already been convicted of a felony, you've lost your right to own guns, and you got caught with one anyway. It shows a disregard for the law and a willingness to break rules even after facing serious consequences. After serving his time, Brenner ended up in rural Utah, living in a trailer on land he didn't own, about 5 miles from Dylan Round's farm. At some point, Brenner and Dylan crossed paths. Brenner needed work. Dylan needed help with his farming operation. So Brenner helped Dylan bale hay. It seemed like a mutually beneficial arrangement. Dylan got cheap labor. Brenner got some money and a reason to stay in the area. Dylan's mother, Candace, later said she'd met Brenner but didn't know him well. She never had any reason for alarm about him. He seemed like just another guy trying to get by in a harsh environment. Dylan never expressed concerns about Brenner to his family. There were no warning signs that anyone noticed. Just two neighbors in a remote area helping each other out. But behind the scenes, something was brewing. We don't know exactly what the relationship between Dylan and Brenner was like. We don't know if there were tensions, disputes, or incidents that Dylan didn't tell his family about. What we do know is that on May 28, 2022, something happened between them. Something violent. Something that ended with Dylan dead and Brenner trying to cover it up. When investigators started looking at Brenner as a potential suspect in Dylan's disappearance, they dug into his recent activities. And what they found was damning. On June 16, 2022, just over 2 weeks after Dylan vanished, the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office, with FBI assistance, executed a search warrant on Brenner's trailer. They were looking for anything that might connect him to Dylan's disappearance. And they found evidence that Brenner was illegally in possession of firearms again, despite his felony conviction. During the search, investigators discovered ball ammunition, ignition caps, black powder, and speed loads, all related to muzzle-loading firearms. But there were no muzzle-loader guns in the trailer at that time. Where had the guns gone? A few days later, they got their answer from an unexpected source. Brenner's neighbor and friend. This neighbor, identified in documents only as DH, told law enforcement that Brenner had brought 3 black powder guns to his house shortly after Dylan's disappearance and asked him to safekeep them. When DH asked why, Brenner allegedly said he needed to do this for his own safety, and that the last time he had trouble with the law they took everything from him, and he did not want the things he had left to be taken again. Think about that for a second. Brenner knew police were investigating Dylan's disappearance. He knew they might come looking at him since he was Dylan's closest neighbor, and his response was to hide his illegal firearms with a friend. That's consciousness of guilt. That's the behavior of someone who knows they're about to be in serious trouble and is trying to eliminate evidence before police find it. But Brenner didn't just give DH the black powder guns. He also gave him a .22 caliber rifle. DH initially didn't mention the rifle to investigators because the rifle had originally belonged to someone who owed DH money, and DH felt he should have a claim on it. But eventually, he told the truth and turned the rifle over to the FBI. The rifle was loaded with 5 rounds of .22 caliber ammunition. Brenner was arrested on June 22, 2022, charged with 3 counts of felony use of a firearm by a restricted person. This arrest wasn't directly related to Dylan's disappearance, at least not officially. It was about Brenner illegally possessing guns as a convicted felon. But it got him off the streets and into custody while investigators continued building their case. And then came the evidence that changed everything. Dylan's abandoned phone was found near a pond by Brenner's trailer. When forensic analysts examined the phone, they discovered something chilling: time-lapse video footage. The phone had apparently been set to record time-lapse video of something. Maybe Dylan was documenting his farm work or equipment. But what it actually captured was far more sinister. The video showed James Brenner, and Brenner had bloodstains on his arms and shirt, and he was cleaning a gun. Investigators obtained the shirt Brenner was wearing in that video. They sent it to the lab for DNA analysis, and the results came back positive. Dylan Round's DNA was on that shirt. Dylan's blood was on James Brenner's clothing. This was the smoking gun. This was proof that Dylan hadn't just wandered off into the desert. He'd been with Brenner. There'd been violence. There'd been blood. And Brenner had been trying to clean up the evidence, not knowing that Dylan's phone was capturing everything. On July 7, 2022, the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office officially named James Brenner as a suspect in Dylan Round's disappearance. Chief Deputy Cade Palmer told reporters that while searching for Dylan, officials found evidence that supported the fact that a homicide likely occurred. In October 2022, the case was officially declared a homicide investigation. But there was still one major problem: no body. They had Dylan's blood. They had Brenner on video with that blood on his clothes. They had circumstantial evidence and suspicious behavior. But they didn't have Dylan's remains. And without a body, building a murder case is incredibly difficult. Defense attorneys can argue that without a body, you can't prove the person is actually dead. Maybe they're injured somewhere. Maybe they're alive and in hiding. Maybe the blood came from a non-fatal injury. Prosecutors knew they needed more. They needed to find Dylan. They needed to know exactly what Brenner had done with him after the murder. They needed to recover his remains so they could determine cause of death, document injuries, and build the strongest case possible. But where was Dylan? What had Brenner done with him? The search continued through 2022 and into 2023. Dozens of volunteers, law enforcement personnel, and search and rescue teams combed the desert. They used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, drones with thermal imaging. They searched abandoned buildings, mine shafts, ravines, anywhere a body could be hidden in that vast expanse of nothing. Dylan's family refused to give up hope that they'd at least be able to bring him home. And all the while, James Brenner sat in jail, refusing to talk, refusing to help, knowing that as long as Dylan's body remained hidden, the case against him was weaker. But time was running out for Brenner, because prosecutors were about to charge him with murder anyway. And sometimes that pressure is exactly what it takes to make a killer finally tell the truth. How does someone live 5 miles from a teenager, work with him, and then murder him? What goes through a person's mind to make that leap? Share your theories below. March 3, 2023. Nearly 10 months after Dylan Rounds disappeared, the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office held a press conference that the Rounds family had been waiting for. James Brenner was being formally charged with criminal homicide, specifically aggravated murder an abuse or desecration of a human body in connection with Dylan's death. Aggravated murder is the most serious homicide charge in Utah. It's reserved for murders that involve specific aggravating circumstances. Murders for hire, murders during the commission of another felony, murders of particularly vulnerable victims, or murders committed in an especially heinous or cruel manner. For prosecutors to charge Brenner with aggravated murder instead of just regular murder meant they believed Dylan's killing met one or more of these criteria. The abuse or desecration of a human body charge told its own story. It meant prosecutors believed Brenner hadn't just killed Dylan. He'd done something with Dylan's body afterward, hidden it, disposed of it, treated it in a way that violated the dignity even a murder victim deserves. This charge suggested Dylan had been buried or concealed somewhere, and that Brenner knew where but wasn't telling. The charges came after what investigators described as a difficult and extensive 9-month investigation. They'd processed hundreds of pieces of evidence. They'd interviewed dozens of witnesses. They'd analyzed forensic data, cell phone records, financial records, surveillance footage from the few cameras in the area. They'd built their case piece by piece, even without having recovered Dylan's body. The probable cause affidavit, the document laying out the evidence supporting the charges, was damning. It detailed the timeline of Dylan's disappearance. It described the suspicious circumstances, the clean truck, the boots, the missing key fob. It documented Brenner's attempts to hide firearms after Dylan vanished. It presented the time-lapse video showing Brenner with blood on his clothes. It included the DNA analysis proving that blood belonged to Dylan. The affidavit also revealed that Brenner had been interviewed multiple times by investigators and had made several claims that corroborated forensic evidence in addition to making numerous demonstrably false statements. In other words, Brenner had lied repeatedly. He'd told stories that didn't match the physical evidence. He'd contradicted himself. He'd shown all the classic signs of someone trying to talk their way out of a murder they'd committed. But Brenner maintained his innocence through his court-appointed attorney. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, and his defense team prepared to argue that the evidence, while suspicious, wasn't enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Brenner had murdered Dylan. After all, there was still no body. How could you prove a murder without a victim's remains? Dylan's family attended every court hearing. Candace, Justin, their other children, extended family members, they filled the courtroom, making sure Dylan was represented, making sure the judge and prosecutors and everyone involved knew that this case mattered. That Dylan mattered. That he wasn't just a case number but a real person whose life had been stolen. The preliminary hearings dragged on through 2023. The defense filed motions to suppress evidence, to exclude certain testimony, to challenge the DNA analysis. Standard defense tactics in a murder case. But each hearing was torture for the family. Sitting there listening to lawyers argue about technicalities, while their son's body was still missing somewhere in the desert. Watching Brenner sit at the defense table, looking bored or indifferent, showing no remorse, no humanity, no willingness to just admit what he'd done and tell them where Dylan was. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were working another angle. They needed Dylan's body, not just for the emotional closure it would bring the family, but for the practical necessity of building the strongest case possible. Without a body, conviction rates in murder trials drop significantly. Juries have trouble accepting that someone is definitely dead without physical proof. Defense attorneys can create reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative scenarios. So prosecutors approached Brenner with an offer. Plea deal. If Brenner would lead them to Dylan's remains, they would reduce the charges. Aggravated murder would become second-degree murder. The abuse of corpse charge would be dropped. Some unrelated charges Brenner was facing would be dismissed. It wasn't a generous deal. He'd still be going to prison for a very long time. But it was better than facing the possibility of life without parole on an aggravated murder conviction. For months, Brenner refused. He sat in his cell and said nothing. The family's anguish continued. They still couldn't bury their son. They still couldn't have a funeral. They still had to live with the knowledge that Dylan was out there somewhere, alone, hidden, while the man who killed him played legal games. But eventually, the pressure got to Brenner. Maybe it was the weight of the charges. Maybe it was facing the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison. Maybe he had some tiny shred of conscience left that made him think about Dylan's family and what they were going through. Whatever the reason, in early 2024, James Brenner finally agreed to the plea deal. He would plead guilty to second-degree murder and 2 counts of possession of a firearm by a restricted person. In exchange, he would lead investigators to Dylan's body. And on April 9, 2024, nearly 2 years after Dylan disappeared, Brenner made good on his promise. He took law enforcement to a remote area in western Box Elder County, near the Utah-Nevada border, not far from Dylan's farm. And there, in a shallow grave in the harsh desert that Dylan had loved and dreamed of farming, they found skeletal remains. The FBI processed the scene. They carefully excavated the remains. They documented everything. And they transported those remains to the Utah office of the medical examiner. On April 10, 2024, the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office announced that skeletal remains presumed to belong to Dylan Rounds had been recovered. On April 11th, the medical examiner confirmed it. The remains were Dylan's. He was finally coming home. Candace coolly spoke to reporters. Her emotions were complicated. Relief that Dylan had been found. Grief that was now concrete and final. He was really gone, really dead, really never coming back. Anger that it had taken Brenner 2 years to do the right thing. Gratitude that they could finally lay Dylan to rest properly. "We were getting ready to plan searches for the summer," she said. "Now we don't have to do that. Have you watched this far because Dylan's story has moved you? Then I need you to do something. Like, share, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss a case where we fight for victims like Dylan. Share this video everywhere with your family, your friends, on social media. The more people who know Dylan's name and story, the more his short life means something. Leave a comment below telling me what you'll remember most about Dylan. And if this case makes you angry about how long it took to bring him home, channel that anger into action by supporting organizations that help families of missing persons. Dylan's family created a nonprofit called Dylan's Legacy to help other families going through what they went through. Consider donating or volunteering. That's how we honor Dylan. That's how we make his death matter. May 15, 2024. The courtroom in Brigham City, Utah was packed. Dylan's family filled multiple rows. Media representatives took notes. And James Brenner stood before Judge Kevin K. Allen to formally enter his guilty plea. This was the moment the Rounds family had been waiting 2 years for. Accountability. Admission of guilt. The truth finally spoken out loud. Brenner pleaded guilty to second-degree felony murder. He also pleaded guilty to 2 counts of possession of a firearm by a restricted person. As part of the plea agreement, the aggravated murder charge was reduced, and the abuse of corpse charge was dismissed. Another unrelated aggravated assault case against Brenner was also dismissed. The sentencing was scheduled for July 1, 2024, and it was during this hearing that the family learned, for the first time, exactly how Dylan had died. The medical examiner's report was finally revealed. Gunshot wound to the head. Dylan Rounds, 19 years old, had been shot in the head and killed. The cause of death that Candace and Justin had feared, but hadn't wanted to believe, was now official record. This revelation brought both clarity and fresh pain. Clarity because they finally knew what had happened. Dylan hadn't suffered for hours or days. The gunshot to the head meant his death was likely quick, if not instantaneous. He probably didn't know what was coming. He probably didn't have time to be afraid. That's a small comfort, but it's something. The pain came from imagining that moment. Dylan probably working on his farm, probably trusting Brenner to some degree, and then a gun, a shot, and his life ending in an instant. What had led to that moment? What had happened between Dylan and Brenner on May 28, 2022 that ended in murder? The details have never been fully revealed. Brenner hasn't given interviews. He hasn't explained his motive. But we can piece together possibilities based on what we know. Maybe there was a dispute about money. Brenner had worked for Dylan baling hay. Maybe he felt Dylan owed him more than he'd been paid. Maybe he asked for money and Dylan refused. Maybe things escalated from an argument to violence. Maybe Brenner pulled a gun to threaten Dylan, and things went too far. Maybe it was about the property. Brenner was squatting on land he didn't own. Maybe Dylan was preparing to report him, to have him removed, to reclaim the area Brenner was occupying. Maybe Brenner felt threatened by the possibility of losing his home, such as it was. Maybe he decided eliminating Dylan was the solution to his problem. Or maybe it was something simpler and more sinister. Maybe Brenner saw an opportunity. A 19-year-old kid, alone on a remote farm with equipment and vehicles and possessions. Maybe Brenner decided to rob Dylan. Maybe the murder was part of a planned theft. Maybe Dylan caught Brenner stealing and confronted him, and Brenner shot him to eliminate the witness. We'll probably never know the exact motive. Brenner has shown no inclination to explain himself. He's shown no remorse. At the hearing, he didn't look at Dylan's family. He didn't apologize. He didn't express any emotion at all. He simply stood there, entered his pleas, and sat back down. The family wanted to see remorse, to see some indication that Brenner understood the enormity of what he'd done. They didn't get it. Candace later told reporters she'd hoped to see Brenner's face, to see if there was any humanity left in him. Him not turning around tells me that it is, she said. Meaning his face is as cold as people had described. Brenner was a man devoid of empathy, devoid of conscience, devoid of any quality that makes us human. He'd killed a teenager over something we'll never fully understand, and he felt nothing about it. The plea deal meant there would be no trial, no jury, no lengthy court proceedings where every detail of Dylan's death would be picked apart. For the family, this was both a relief and a frustration. Relief because they didn't have to sit through weeks or months of a trial, didn't have to hear defense attorneys try to make excuses for Brenner, didn't have to risk the small possibility of an acquittal. Frustration because there would be no public reckoning, no full airing of what Brenner had done, no moment where 12 citizens looked at the evidence and said guilty with the full weight of the justice system behind it. But the family took what victory they could. Brenner had admitted guilt. He'd led them to Dylan's remains. He would be going to prison. Those were the important things. Everything else was just procedure. The medical examiner released Dylan's remains to the family's chosen funeral home. Finally, after 2 years, Candace and Justin could plan their son's funeral. They could give him a proper burial. They could have a place to visit, to leave flowers, to sit and remember him. They could begin the process of grieving properly instead of existing in the limbo of not knowing where he was. The funeral was private, attended by family and close friends. Dylan was laid to rest in Idaho, the state where he'd grown up, surrounded by the family who'd loved him and the community that had watched him grow from a little boy with farming dreams into a teenager making those dreams reality. At the funeral, people shared memories of Dylan, his dedication, his work ethic, his passion for farming, his love for his family, his dreams for the future. His younger siblings talked about looking up to their big brother, about wanting to be like him. His parents talked about being so proud of him, about watching him pursue something difficult and unconventional with such determination. His grandparents remembered the little boy who'd talked about tractors and combines before he could even read. And they all grappled with the same impossible question. Why? Why did this happen? Why did James Brenner, a man Dylan had worked with, a man Dylan had probably trusted to some degree, decide to take his life? What could possibly motivate someone to murder a teenager who was just trying to farm his land and live his dream? The answer, if there even is one, died with Dylan that day. Brenner isn't talking. He's provided no explanation, no justification, no insight into his thinking. He shot Dylan, he buried him in the desert, and he tried to get away with it. That's all we know for certain. The why will forever remain a question mark that haunts Dylan's family. What motivates someone to murder over something so seemingly insignificant that they won't even explain it years later? Is it pure evil, or is there always a reason we just can't see? Comment your thoughts. July 1st, 2024. The day James Brenner would finally face consequences for murdering Dylan Rounds. The courtroom was packed again. More than 24 of Dylan's family members made the trip to Brigham City to be present for the sentencing. They'd been waiting for this moment for over 2 years. This was their chance to speak directly to Brenner, to tell him what his actions had cost them, to make sure he understood. Even if he didn't care, the devastation he'd caused. Victim impact statements are a crucial part of the sentencing process. They give victims and their families a voice in court, a chance to explain to the judge and to the defendant how the crime has affected their lives. For Dylan's family, these statements were an opportunity to make sure Dylan was seen as more than just a case file, more than just a victim. They wanted everyone in that courtroom to know who Dylan was, what he meant to them, and what they'd lost. Candace Cooley, Dylan's mother, spoke first. Her statement was raw with grief and anger. She described the agony of not knowing where her son was for 2 years, the torture of searching the desert, calling his name, hoping against hope he might somehow still be alive, the nightmares of imagining what his final moments were like, the guilt she felt for not being there to protect him, the rage she felt toward Brenner for stealing her son's life and then making the family suffer for 2 more years by refusing to say where he'd buried Dylan. She talked about Dylan's dreams, how from the time he was a little boy, all he wanted was to be a farmer, how most people thought he was crazy for wanting to live alone in the desert at 19, but how she'd supported him because she knew it wasn't just a phase. It was his life's calling. How proud she was of him for having the courage to pursue something difficult and unconventional. How he'd been so close to realizing his dream when Brenner took everything away from him. Justin Rounds, Dylan's father, also gave a statement. He talked about the father-son relationship they'd had, the times they'd worked on farm equipment together, the pride he'd felt watching Dylan become independent and capable, the plans they'd made for Dylan's farm, how Justin was going to help him with the first harvest, how they were going to build a proper house on the property eventually, how Dylan's farm was going to be a family legacy. All of those plans died with Dylan. All of those future memories were stolen by Brenner's actions. Dylan's younger brother spoke about losing his role model, his big brother who'd taught him about machinery and hard work and following your dreams. His siblings talked about the hole in their family, the empty seat at holidays, the phone calls that will never come. His grandparents talked about the special bond they'd had with Dylan, about being partners in his farming dream, about never getting to see him succeed the way they knew he would have. More than 24 statements. 24 people whose lives were forever changed by what James Brenner did on May 28, 2022. Each statement was a testament to Dylan's impact, to how much he was loved, to how deeply he's missed. And through all of it, Brenner sat stone-faced at the defense table, showing no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. The prosecutor also spoke. They argued for the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. They emphasized the brutality of the crime, shooting a teenager in the head, the callousness of burying him in the desert like trash, the cruelty of refusing for 2 years to tell the family where he was. The prosecutor painted Brenner as exactly what he was, a cold-blooded killer who deserved the harshest punishment the law could impose. Brenner's defense attorney made a brief statement asking for leniency, arguing that Brenner had ultimately done the right thing by leading investigators to Dylan's body, that he deserved some credit for that cooperation. The argument was weak and everyone knew it. Brenner had only cooperated when facing the possibility of life without parole. He hadn't done it out of conscience or compassion. He'd done it to save himself from harsher punishment. Then it was Judge Kevin K. Allen's turn to speak. He acknowledged the family's pain. He noted the seriousness of the crime, and he handed down the sentence. 15 years to life for the second-degree murder charge. 1 year for each of the 2 firearm possession charges, to run concurrently. Brenner would be eligible for parole after serving 15 years, but there was no guarantee he'd ever be released. That decision would be up to the parole board when the time came. 15 years to life. It meant Brenner, who was 62 years old at sentencing, would be at least 77 before he could even be considered for parole. If the parole board denied him, which they likely would multiple times given the nature of his crime, he could easily spend the rest of his life in prison. For Dylan's family, it wasn't enough. No sentence could ever be enough, but it was something. Brenner would die in prison, just as he deserved. After the sentencing, Candace spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. She said she was relieved that this chapter was finally closing, that knowing Brenner would spend the rest of his life behind bars brought some measure of peace. But she also made it clear that the family's work wasn't done. They wanted to make sure Dylan's story was told, that other families of missing persons got the support they needed, that young people pursuing unconventional dreams weren't forgotten when tragedy struck. The family had established Dylan's legacy, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons. They knew firsthand how difficult it is to coordinate searches, to deal with law enforcement, to handle media attention, to keep hope alive while preparing for the worst. They wanted to use what they'd learned through their nightmare to help others going through similar experiences. It was a way to honor Dylan, to make his death mean something beyond just a tragic news story. Dylan's case also highlighted issues with rural safety and the challenges of living in extremely remote areas. When you're miles from the nearest person, when cell service is spotty or non-existent, when help is an hour away even if you can call for it, you're vulnerable in ways most people never have to consider. Dylan loved the isolation of his farm, but that isolation also made him an easy target for someone like Brenner. Should there be better communication systems for people living in remote areas? Should there be more frequent welfare checks on people living alone in the wilderness? These are questions without easy answers. Dylan valued his independence and probably wouldn't have wanted constant oversight. But maybe some kind of regular check-in system, daily texts or calls to family, for example, could have made a difference. Maybe if Dylan had missed even one check-in, help would have arrived sooner. We'll never know. What we do know is that James Brenner will spend the rest of his life paying for what he did. He took a 19-year-old's future away. He destroyed a family. He snuffed out a dream. And for what? We still don't know. Brenner has never explained his motive. He's never apologized. He's never shown any indication that he regrets his actions. He's simply a void where a conscience should be. A man who killed for reasons we'll never understand and doesn't seem to care about the devastation he caused. Dylan's family can finally begin to heal now that they have answers and justice. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean the pain goes away. It just means they learn to live with it, to carry Dylan's memory forward, to find purpose in their grief. And that's exactly what they're doing through Dylan's legacy and through keeping his story alive. If you've watched this far and Dylan's story has affected you, I have one request. Hit that like button right now. Then share this video with everyone you know, your friends, your family, post it on social media. The more people who hear about Dylan Rounds, the more his short life matters. Leave a comment below telling me what you think should happen to people like James Brenner, who refused to reveal where they hid victims for years. Let me know your thoughts. And if you want to support Dylan's family's mission, visit the Dylan's Legacy website and see how you can help other families of missing persons. That's how we turn tragedy into purpose. Now that the case is resolved and Brenner has been sentenced, we can look more closely at the evidence that brought him down. Because what's remarkable about this case is how much investigators were able to piece together despite the remote location, the lack of witnesses, and Brenner's attempts to destroy evidence. The starting point was Dylan's phone. Not the phone itself initially, but the data it generated. Cell phone tower records showed Dylan's phone was active on the morning of May 28, 2022, near his farm. Then suddenly, around midday, all activity stopped. The phone either died, was turned off, or was destroyed. This created a timeline. Whatever happened to Dylan happened on May 28th, probably around midday. But where was the physical phone? That question was answered when investigators found it near a pond by Brenner's trailer, about 5 miles from Dylan's farm. How did Dylan's phone end up at Brenner's place? The obvious answer: Brenner took it there after killing Dylan. Maybe he planned to destroy it but didn't get around to it. Maybe he threw it thinking it would sink in the pond, but it didn't. Whatever the reason, that phone became one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. When forensic specialists examined the phone, they discovered it contained time-lapse video. Apparently Dylan had set his phone to record time-lapse footage. Maybe he was documenting his work on the farm, or watching weather patterns, or just playing around with the camera feature. But what it ended up capturing was James Brenner, standing near Dylan's equipment, with visible bloodstains on his arms and shirt, cleaning a gun. Think about how incredible this is. Brenner didn't know he was being recorded. He thought he'd gotten away with murder. He thought he'd cleaned up all the evidence. But Dylan's phone, probably lying in the grass or propped up somewhere to record farm work, captured his killer in the act of trying to cover up the crime. It's almost poetic, Dylan, even after death, providing the evidence that would identify his murderer. The video wasn't perfect. It was time-lapse, so it didn't show continuous action. It didn't capture the actual murder. But it showed Brenner with blood on his clothes and a gun in his hands shortly after Dylan disappeared. Combined with other evidence, it was damning. Investigators obtained the shirt Brenner was wearing in the video. This required a search warrant for Brenner's trailer, which they executed on June 16, 2022. They found the shirt and sent it to the lab for DNA analysis. The results came back positive. The blood on Brenner's shirt was Dylan Round's blood. This was proof positive that Dylan had bled onto Brenner's clothing, which suggested extremely close contact during a violent event. Exactly what you'd expect in a murder. The gun shown in the video was also critical evidence. Investigators determined it was a .22 caliber rifle. Remember, Dylan's cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. While investigators haven't publicly confirmed that this specific gun was the murder weapon, that would require finding the bullet and matching it ballistically, which may not have been possible given the condition of Dylan's remains after 2 years. The presence of a gun in Brenner's hands shortly after Dylan's disappearance, combined with Dylan's blood on his shirt, painted a clear picture. Brenner's attempts to hide firearms after Dylan's disappearance also constituted evidence of consciousness of guilt. When someone commits a crime and immediately starts trying to hide evidence, it shows they know they've done something wrong. Brenner giving his guns to his neighbor DH and asking him to safekeep them was a clear indication that Brenner knew he was about to be investigated and wanted to eliminate evidence. DH's testimony was crucial. He confirmed that Brenner had brought him 3 black powder guns and 1.22 caliber rifle shortly after Dylan disappeared. He confirmed that Brenner said he was doing this for his own safety and didn't want his possessions taken by law enforcement like they had been in the past. This testimony established that Brenner was anticipating police scrutiny and was taking steps to obstruct the investigation. The condition of Dylan's grain truck was also evidence, though more circumstantial. The truck appeared to have been power washed clean. In the dusty desert environment where Dylan lived, a spotlessly clean truck stands out. Why would someone thoroughly clean a truck in the middle of farm country where it's going to get dusty again immediately? The likely answer, because there was evidence on or in that truck that needed to be destroyed. Blood, perhaps. Fingerprints. DNA. Something that connected Brenner to the truck and to Dylan's murder. The location of Dylan's boots was another piece of the puzzle. They were found in the dirt near the grain truck, but not where Dylan would typically leave them. They were yards away from where the truck was parked, in the opposite direction from his camper. This suggested Dylan had been at or near his truck when something happened to him. Maybe he was working on the truck. Maybe Brenner approached him while he was there. Maybe there was a confrontation. Whatever happened, Dylan didn't walk away. His boots were left behind, and in desert country you don't go anywhere without boots. Dylan's missing key fob was also significant. The key fob to his truck was never found. This suggested someone took it, probably the killer. Why take a key fob? Maybe to move the truck. Maybe to search it. Maybe just to take something as a trophy or to make sure Dylan couldn't use the truck to escape or call for help. The missing key fob was one more detail that pointed toward foul play rather than Dylan simply wandering off. The location where Brenner eventually led investigators to Dylan's body was telling too. It was in a remote area of western Box Elder County. Not far from Dylan's farm, but far enough that casual searchers wouldn't have found it. The grave was shallow, suggesting Brenner had either been in a hurry or hadn't had good tools for digging. He'd chosen a spot that would have kept Dylan hidden indefinitely if Brenner hadn't eventually revealed the location. The fact that Dylan's remains were skeletal after 2 years in the desert made forensic analysis more challenging. Soft tissue evidence was gone. Exact time of death couldn't be determined. The bullet wound to the head could be identified, but details about the shooting, range, angle, whether there was one shot or multiple shots, might have been lost to decomposition. This is why prosecutors wanted the body so badly. Even degraded remains provide more evidence than no remains at all. All of this evidence together created an overwhelming case against Brenner. The time-lapse video with blood on his clothes. The DNA match proving it was Dylan's blood. The gun in his hands. His attempts to hide firearms, his lies to investigators, his eventual leading them to the body. No single piece of evidence might have been enough to convict on its own, but together, They told a complete story of murder and attempted cover-up. This is why investigators spend so much time processing crime scenes and analyzing evidence. This is why they document everything, collect everything, test everything. Because you never know which piece of evidence will be the one that breaks the case open. In Dylan's case, it was a phone he probably didn't even realize was recording that captured his killer and ultimately brought him to justice. What piece of evidence do you think was most critical in this case? The time-lapse video? The DNA on the shirt? Brenner's attempts to hide guns? Or the combination of everything together? Comment below. After Dylan's murder, after the agonizing 2-year wait for answers, after the trial and sentencing, the Rounds family could have quietly grieved and tried to move on with their lives. No one would have blamed them. They'd been through unimaginable trauma. They deserved peace. But instead, they chose to do something incredibly difficult and incredibly important. They decided to help other families going through similar nightmares. Dylan's legacy was established as a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons. The Rounds family knew from painful personal experience how overwhelming it is when someone you love goes missing. The chaos, the fear, the desperate need to do something but not knowing what. The difficulty of coordinating searches in remote areas. The challenges of working with law enforcement agencies that may not have resources for extensive searches. The media attention that can be both helpful and intrusive. The financial strain of traveling to search sites, taking time off work, hiring private investigators if needed. Through Dylan's legacy, the family provides resources and support to other families facing these challenges. They help coordinate volunteer search efforts. They connect families with experienced search and rescue teams. They provide emotional support from people who truly understand what they're going through. They help navigate the complex relationship with law enforcement and media. They offer hope when hope seems impossible, and they offer honest guidance about preparing for worst-case scenarios. Candace Cooley has become an advocate for families of missing persons. She speaks publicly about Dylan's case, not just to keep his memory alive, but to raise awareness about the issues these families face. She talks about the need for better resources for rural searches, for improved communication systems in remote areas, for protocols that take missing persons reports seriously from day one rather than waiting for the person to be missing for 24 or 48 hours. She also talks about the emotional toll on families, the guilt that parents feel when their adult children go missing. Should we have checked on them more often? Should we have insisted they live somewhere less isolated? Should we have seen warning signs? The answer to all of these questions is no, but that doesn't stop the guilt. Candace wants other parents to know they're not alone in these feelings, that the blame lies with the person who committed the crime, not with the family who couldn't prevent it. Justin Rounds has also been involved in Dylan's legacy, though he's less publicly visible than Candace. He works behind the scenes, helping with the logistical aspects of search coordination, using his knowledge of rural areas and equipment to advise other families on effective search strategies. He understands what it's like to search vast, empty spaces for someone you love. He knows the desperation of calling someone's name into the wind and hearing only silence in return. And he uses that knowledge to help others. The family has organized annual events in Dylan's memory. These events serve multiple purposes. They raise funds for Dylan's legacy, they keep Dylan's name and story alive, and they bring together families who've experienced similar tragedies to support one another. There's something powerful about being around people who truly understand what you're going through, who don't offer empty platitudes but instead offer practical support and genuine empathy born from shared experience. One of Dylan's legacy's focuses is on improving safety for young people living alone in remote areas. They advocate for regular check-in systems, for buddy systems where people in isolated locations agree to check on each other daily, for better GPS tracking technology that could help locate someone quickly if they go missing. These aren't foolproof solutions. Dylan's case shows that sometimes even being found quickly wouldn't have saved him, but they're tools that could help in some situations. The organization also works to educate young people pursuing unconventional careers or lifestyles about staying safe. Dylan's dream of farming alone in the desert was beautiful and brave, but it also left him vulnerable. How do you balance following your dreams with taking reasonable safety precautions? It's a difficult question without easy answers. Dylan's legacy tries to help young people think through these issues, plan for emergencies, and stay connected even when pursuing isolated careers. Dylan's younger siblings have been involved in the organization as well. They want to honor their brother's memory by helping others. They talk to young people about Dylan, what he was like, what he dreamed of, what he accomplished in his short life. They make him real. Not just a tragic news story, but a person who loved farming and worked hard and deserved to live long enough to see his dreams come true. This personal connection helps people understand the human impact of crimes like Dylan's murder. The family has also advocated for changes in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly in rural areas. When Dylan went missing, coordinating searches across the vast empty spaces of the Utah-Nevada border was incredibly challenging. Cell service was limited. The terrain was harsh. Resources were spread thin. Dylan's legacy works with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for rural missing persons cases, to ensure families have the support they need, and to maximize the chances of finding missing people quickly. They've also pushed for harsher penalties for people who hide bodies and refuse to reveal locations. In Dylan's case, Brenner's refusal to say where he buried Dylan for 2 years added immeasurable suffering to the family's grief. Some states have passed no body, no parole laws that make it impossible for convicted murderers to be paroled unless they reveal where their victims are buried. Dylan's legacy supports these laws and advocates for their adoption in more states. The family's work through Dylan's legacy is bittersweet. They'd give anything to have Dylan back, to trade all their advocacy work for just one more conversation with him. But since that's impossible, they've chosen to make his death mean something. They've chosen to help others so that other families might not have to endure everything they endured. They've chosen to turn their grief into purpose. And they want people to remember Dylan not as a victim but as a dreamer. A 19-year-old kid who loved farming so much that he was willing to live alone in the desert to pursue it. A hard worker who wasn't afraid of difficult conditions or long hours. An independent person who valued self-reliance and determination. A son and brother and grandson who was loved deeply and is missed every single day. The work Dylan's legacy does ensures that Dylan Round's name won't be forgotten, that his story will continue to be told, that other families will benefit from the lessons learned through his case, and that maybe, just maybe, some other young person pursuing an unconventional dream in a remote location will be a little bit safer because of the awareness Dylan's case has raised. Thank you for staying with Dylan's story this far. If his case has moved you and you believe his family's mission matters, I'm asking you to take action right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're always updated when we cover cases like this. Like this video to help it reach more people. The algorithm needs to know this content matters. Share this everywhere you can, your social media, your group chats, with anyone who cares about justice. Leave a comment telling me what you think Dylan's legacy should be or sharing any other cases you'd like me to cover. And most importantly, if you can, visit the Dylan's Legacy website and consider donating or volunteering. This family turned their worst nightmare into a mission to help others. That deserves our support. Now let's continue. While Dylan's case was ultimately solved and his killer brought to justice, we need to talk about the failures that occurred along the way. Because understanding what went wrong is how we prevent similar tragedies in the future. The first and most obvious failure was James Brenner himself being in a position to harm Dylan. Brenner was a convicted felon. He'd served federal prison time for being a felon in possession of a firearm. He was explicitly prohibited from owning or possessing guns. And yet, when Dylan was murdered, Brenner had access to multiple firearms, including the gun likely used to kill Dylan. How does this happen? The answer is that enforcing gun restrictions on convicted felons is incredibly difficult, especially in rural areas where gun ownership is common and gun culture means people don't always ask questions when someone acquires a firearm. Brenner shouldn't have had guns, but he did, and there was no system in place that would have detected this before he used one to commit murder. Some might argue this shows gun laws don't work. Others argue it shows we need better enforcement of existing gun laws. Whatever your position on gun control, the fact remains. A convicted felon who was legally prohibited from having guns had access to guns, and that access enabled him to murder a teenager. This is a system failure. Another failure was the isolation that made Dylan vulnerable. He was living alone, 5 miles from his nearest neighbor, in an area with spotty cell service. When something happened to him, there was no one to see it, no one to hear calls for help, no one to intervene. By the time his family realized something was wrong and came looking for him, it was too late. He'd been dead for days. Should young people be discouraged from living in such isolated conditions? That seems wrong. Dylan had every right to pursue his dream of farming, and that dream required living on his remote property. But should there be systems in place to check on people living alone in isolated areas? Daily check-ins with family? GPS trackers that alert someone if you stop moving for too long? These safety measures would have to be voluntary. We can't force people to be monitored. But maybe if such systems had existed and Dylan had been encouraged to use them, his family would have known something was wrong sooner. Maybe they would have found his body before Brenner had time to hide it. Maybe the evidence would have been fresher and the case would have been easier to solve. Or maybe it wouldn't have made any difference at all. We'll never know. There were also failures in the investigation, though these are more understandable given the challenging circumstances. The crime scene was processed, but Brenner had time to clean Dylan's truck and hide evidence before police arrived. The remote location meant there were no witnesses, no nearby surveillance cameras, nothing that would have immediately pointed investigators toward Brenner as the suspect. And then there was the 2-year delay in recovering Dylan's body. Brenner knew where Dylan was buried. He'd put him there. He could have told investigators at any point during those 2 years. But he didn't. He let the family suffer, let them search, let them wonder, let them live in agonizing uncertainty. And the system allowed this because there was no legal mechanism to force him to reveal the location. This is where no body, no parole laws come in. Some states have passed legislation that makes convicted murderers ineligible for parole unless they reveal where they disposed of their victims' bodies. The idea is to give killers an incentive to provide this information. If you want any chance at freedom someday, you have to tell the family where their loved one is. Utah doesn't have such a law, which meant Brenner could hold that information hostage for 2 years, only revealing it when he finally accepted a plea deal. Should Utah pass a no body, no parole law? Dylan's legacy certainly thinks so. The family has advocated for such legislation, arguing that no family should have to endure what they endured. 2 years of not knowing where their loved one was, 2 years of being unable to hold a funeral, 2 years of torment that could have been avoided if Brenner had been required to reveal Dylan's location sooner. Critics of such laws argue they could incentivize false information. A defendant might make up a location just to become eligible for parole someday, sending investigators on wild goose chases. Supporters counter that verification would be required. You have to actually produce remains, not just provide coordinates. It's a complex policy question without perfect answers. There's also the question of whether Brenner should have been investigated more thoroughly earlier in the process. He was Dylan's closest neighbor. He had a criminal history. He'd worked for Dylan. When Dylan disappeared under suspicious circumstances, Brenner should have been an immediate person of interest. And police did investigate him. But it took time to gather enough evidence to charge him, and during that time, Brenner had opportunities to further conceal evidence. If investigators had found Dylan's phone sooner, they would have seen the time-lapse video of Brenner with blood on his clothes and a gun in his hands. If they'd been able to search Brenner's trailer immediately, they might have found more evidence before he had a chance to hide or destroy it. But in the real world, police need probable cause for searches. They need evidence to support warrants. They can't just raid someone's home because they're a person of interest. The system is designed to protect civil liberties, which sometimes means investigations move slower than families would like. The media coverage of Dylan's case also had both positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, the coverage kept the case in the public eye, generated tips, and maintained pressure on investigators to solve it. Dylan's face was on the news regularly. People knew his name and story. That attention probably helped ensure the investigation remained a priority rather than becoming a cold case that got forgotten. On the negative side, intense media coverage can sometimes compromise investigations. It can alert suspects to what investigators know, can taint potential jury pools. It can invade the family's privacy during their worst moments. The Rounds family handled media attention with grace, using it as a tool to aid in finding Dylan rather than letting it overwhelm them. But not all families are able to navigate that balance. Finally, there's the systemic failure of rural communities not having adequate resources for major investigations. When Dylan disappeared, local law enforcement was quickly overwhelmed. They needed help from the FBI and other agencies. Search and rescue teams were stretched thin, covering vast areas. The investigation was complex and resource-intensive, and small rural departments simply don't have budgets and staff for sustained efforts of that magnitude. None of these failures excuse what James Brenner did. He's solely responsible for murdering Dylan. But understanding the systemic issues that allowed that murder to happen, that made solving it more difficult, and that prolonged the family's suffering is important if we want to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Every failure is a lesson. Every gap in the system is an opportunity for improvement. Dylan's death should mean something beyond just one murder solved. It should drive positive changes that make other people safer. We've spent the last 45 minutes talking about evidence and investigations and failures and justice. But let's end where we should have started, with Dylan Rounds himself. Not Dylan the victim, not Dylan the murdered farmer, just Dylan, the person. Dylan was 19 years old when he died. 19. Most 19-year-olds are still figuring out what they want from life. They're trying different majors in college, working entry-level jobs, living with roommates, going to parties, making mistakes, learning who they are. Dylan already knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. At an age when most people are still exploring possibilities, Dylan had found his purpose. Farming. From the time he was a little boy, Dylan loved farming. Not in a casual way, but with a passion that consumed him. He studied farming. He learned about equipment and crops and soil and water management. He saved money specifically for his future farm. While other kids his age were buying video games or concert tickets, Dylan was putting every dollar toward land and equipment. That's not normal teenage behavior. That's dedication. That's someone who knows their calling and is willing to sacrifice for it. And sacrifice he did. Dylan dropped out of high school to focus on farming. That decision probably worried his parents, but they supported him because they recognized this wasn't a kid being lazy or giving up. This was someone pursuing their dream with single-minded determination. He didn't need a diploma to be a farmer. He needed land, equipment, knowledge, and work ethic. He had all of those things. At 16, Dylan and his grandfather purchased farmland in Lucin, Utah. Think about that. 16 years old and he's buying farmland. Most 16-year-olds are getting their driver's licenses and maybe working part-time at fast food restaurants. Dylan was becoming a landowner and planning his farming operation. The maturity and focus required for that is extraordinary. He chose Lucin specifically because the land was cheap and available. It was desert. It was remote. Most people wouldn't want it. But Dylan saw potential. He saw acres of land he could farm, space where he could build something, a place where he could live his dream away from the noise and complications of city life. He wasn't afraid of the isolation. He wasn't intimidated by the challenge of making desert land productive. He was excited about the opportunity. For 3 years, from 2019 to 2022, Dylan prepared. He worked other jobs to earn money. He bought equipment. He learned the land. He set up his camper trailer and started living on the property full-time. No running water, no luxuries, just him and the desert and the work he loved. And he was happy. His family says he was living exactly the life he wanted. He was pursuing his dream and he was succeeding. By May 2022, Dylan was ready to plant his first real crop. All the preparation, all the hard work, all the sacrifices were about to pay off. He was on the verge of becoming what he'd always wanted to be. A farmer with his own operation, growing crops, making a living from the land. He was 19 years old and about to achieve what most people spend decades working toward. His future was bright and full of promise. And then James Brenner shot him in the head and buried him in the desert. And all of that potential, all of that promise, all of that future was gone in an instant. Dylan never got to plant that crop. Never got to drive his combine across fields he'd planted himself. Never got to see his first harvest. Never got to expand his operation or build a house or marry or have kids or grow old. Brenner stole all of that from him. Dylan's family remembers him as more than just a farmer, though. He was a son who stayed in contact with his parents even while living alone in the desert. A brother who was a role model to his younger siblings. A grandson who partnered with his grandfather to make his dream real. A friend who was kind and hardworking and determined. A person who loved what he did and brought passion to everything he touched. His mom talks about how proud she was of him. How she worried about him living so remotely but respected his independence. How she loved bringing him supplies and seeing how happy he was on his farm. How she thought they'd have decades more of watching him build his operation and achieve his goals. How the hole his death left in her life will never be filled. His dad talks about the father-son bond they had. Working on equipment together. Planning for Dylan's farm. Being excited about the future. And then losing all of that in a single act of violence that made no sense. That came from a person they'd never seen as a threat. That stole their son for reasons they'll never fully understand. His siblings talk about looking up to their big brother. About how he taught them that it's okay to pursue unconventional dreams, that you don't have to follow the expected path to be successful and happy. About how his courage to live alone in the desert and chase his dream inspired them to be brave in pursuing their own goals. About how much they miss him and always will. Have you watched this far because Dylan's story has moved you? Then I need you to do something. Like, share, hit that subscribe button, and turn on all notifications so you never miss a case where we fight for victims like Dylan. Share this video everywhere with your family, your friends, on social media. The more people who know Dylan's name and story, the more his short life means something. Leave a comment below telling me what you'll remember most about Dylan. And if this case makes you angry about how long it took to bring him home, channel that anger into action by supporting organizations that help families of missing persons. Dylan's family created a nonprofit called Dylan's Legacy to help other families going through what they went through. Consider donating or volunteering. That's how we honor Dylan. That's how we make his death matter.